The first thing Kale noticed about the alien girl was that she was trying to die quietly. She lay half-buried in a collapsed snowdrift at the base of a ridgeline that had no name on any human chart, only a set of coordinates that translated roughly to sector nobody goes to. The storm had chewed through the region for 6 days running. Kale had been out here for 5 of them. He'd stopped counting hours sometime around the 3rd night when his chrono display fogged over from the inside and refused to clear. He almost missed her. Would have, except his boot caught the edge of something rigid beneath the surface crust, not rock, not ice-hardened debris, and he dropped to one knee out of instinct rather than curiosity, scraping away the top layer with his gauntlet. The violet skin was the second thing he noticed. The third was that she was breathing. He crouched there for a long moment, storm wind kicking fine ice crystals against the side of his helmet, and thought about all the ways this was not his problem. Command had been clear. Extract the black box recorder from the downed scout ship, confirm the telemetry was intact, get out before the Veth Coalition patrol swept through. Nothing in those orders mentioned wounded Veth civilians. Nothing in those orders accounted for violet-skinned girls with silver hair plastered to their faces by blood and frost, fingers curled around a pendant at their throat like it was the only real thing left in the world. He pulled her out anyway. He'd like to say it was a tactical decision. He'd thought about claiming later, if anyone asked, that a living Veth could be leverage, could be intelligence, could be a reason to stay his hand rather than trigger a diplomatic incident. He could have constructed that argument. It would have held up, technically. But the truth was simpler and considerably more embarrassing. She reminded him of someone who had once disappeared without warning, and he had never made peace with the fact that he'd done nothing. Getting her out of the drift took 7 minutes and cost him the skin of 2 knuckles, where the ice crust was harder than it looked. She was lighter than he expected. Veth built lean, the xenobiology report said, optimized for a homeworld with 2/3 standard gravity, but dead weight was dead weight, and the angle was bad, and he had to work around her wound without making it worse. He could see the wound now. It was not from a fall. The edge was too clean, the thermal signature of the surrounding tissue still faintly elevated even through the cold. Particle discharge, close range. Someone had stood over her and shot her and left her in the snow. He got her onto his shoulder and started for the bivouac. He'd like to say he was certain she was going to survive. He was not. The thermal reading from her body was depressed in the way that said the cold had been working on her for a while, and particle burns went systemic in ways that were difficult to predict even in human patients, and he had precisely no training in Veth physiology. What he had was the emergency kit he carried out of habit rather than orders, the one his squad leader back in the 14th had once called Kale's bindle of unnecessary preparedness. 3 antiseptic compound formats, 2 rated for non-human biology, neither of them Veth. He improvised, which was either the beginning of a story or the beginning of a death, and he'd been in enough situations to know you never found out which until much later. The shelter was a collapsed thermal bivouac, a fabric shell that generated a heat pocket barely large enough for 2 people when deployed in low configuration. He'd been using it alone, which meant he had to recalculate the thermal math and accept that neither of them was going to be fully warm. He tucked her against the inner wall, wedged his pack between her and the outer membrane to act as insulation, and sat with his back against the opposite side. The wound needed attention before anything else. He cut away the outer layer of her field jacket with his tool knife, working slowly, trying not to cause secondary damage from movement. The jacket was military-grade, layered, the kind of thing you wore when you expected to be exposed rather than to look impressive. Another data point. She was not a civilian, whatever she was. Underneath, the wound, about 15 centimeters long, irregular at the entry point where the beam had skimmed rather than struck cleanly, deeper at one end than the other. The cauterization had held, but it was not clean cauterization. Someone had used a weapon not optimized for precision. the kind of shot you took quickly in low light at a moving target. She had been running when they hit her. She had still been running when she went down into the snow. He used the second format antiseptic, the one rated for silicon-based biology, because it was the closest match he could reason toward for a species with bioluminescent skin chemistry, sealed the wound margins with the emergency tissue adhesive, and wrapped it with the compression bandage from the bottom of the kit. It was field medicine for an alien physiology, improvised by a soldier with training in neither xenobiology nor surgery, under combat conditions, in inadequate light. He'd done worse. He opened the field ration he'd been saving for the walk back and ate half of it cold, trying to remember the last full meal he'd had. Somewhere around 42 hours ago, he decided. Base camp, a pressed protein block that tasted of nothing and reconstituted coffee that tasted of old metal. He ate the second half of the ration slowly, the way you learned to eat when you'd been hungry enough times that your body understood food might not come again for a while. Outside, the storm screamed. He thought about the pendant around her neck while he ate. It was small, cast in what appeared to be a pale metal that didn't corrode or scratch easily. He could see that even in low light, shaped like two lines that crossed and curled at the ends, a symbol he'd seen before in Veth iconography, without ever knowing what it meant. He'd asked the intelligence officer back at base about Veth symbolic traditions once, during a briefing that had been mostly about orbital gun ranges and patrol frequencies. The intelligence officer had looked at him the way people looked at a dog that had unexpectedly asked a philosophical question, and said she'd look into it. She hadn't. He was starting to think the shape was a name, not a word, not a title, a name. The way some old human cultures had represented names in written form, carrying the name sound in the curves of the letters. If that was right, someone had made this pendant for her. Someone had put her name into metal and given it to her to keep. And someone else had shot her and left her in the snow. Those two facts sat next to each other in his head and refused to become one coherent story. Ren's eyes opened at hour 10. They were not like human eyes. The iris was a deep amber, nearly copper, and the pupil was not round but a vertical split that opened and contracted with alarming precision, adjusting to the low light of the bivouac like a camera shutter. She looked at him without moving, which took a kind of nerve he recognized and respected. Most people, waking up in pain in an unknown place next to an unknown figure, made a noise. She made nothing, just tracked him with those copper eyes and waited. "You're hurt," he said, then felt immediately stupid because she could presumably feel that. The translator at his collar chimed and rendered something back. What she said, according to the translation matrix, was either "I am aware of this" or "this fact has weight." The translator had a habit of conflating certainty with mass. He'd complained about it 3 times in formal requisitions, and twice in person to the tech officer, who had smiled and filed the complaints somewhere they would never be found. "The wound is sealed," he said. "I don't know if I did it right. I used what I had." Another chime. Translation, "You stayed." The way she said it, the way the translator rendered it, was not a question. It was more like a fact being acknowledged, the way you'd note that the sun had come up. Matter of fact. But there was something underneath it, some harmonic the translator couldn't parse, that sounded like the beginning of a question that didn't have a word yet. "I stayed," he said. She closed her eyes. Not unconsciousness this time, deliberate, considered. A shutting down of external processing to focus inward. He'd seen humans do the same thing in field hospitals, when the pain was present but manageable, and there was nothing useful to do except endure it. He pulled his knees up to his chest, turned down the output on his headlamp to its lowest setting, and listened to the storm work through its registers. Howl dropping to keen, keen dropping to moan, moan holding steady at a frequency that was almost musical if you'd been out in it long enough to stop hearing threat and start hearing weather. When the storm eased to something below a moan around hour 14, she spoke again without opening her eyes. The translator worked on it for several seconds longer than usual. "Are you afraid of me?" He thought about lying, decided against it. "Not currently. Ask me again if you try to take my sidearm." A long pause, then a sound that the translator didn't even attempt, a rapid modulated rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere at the back of her throat. He'd heard that sound from Veth prisoners once before the prisoner exchange, and hadn't known what to make of it then either. Later, a Veth linguist who'd been part of a brief, failed peace initiative had told a journalist. The journalist had told anyone who'd listen, for about 3 weeks until a new crisis eclipsed the story, that the sound was laughter, or the closest thing. Less about humor than about the recognition of absurdity. The moment where a situation is so strange that the only honest response is to make a noise. She was laughing at him. He felt unreasonably pleased about this. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, because it seemed like the natural next question, and because he'd been turning it over in his head since he'd pulled her from the snow. She didn't answer right away. He had the impression she was deciding not how to answer, but whether to, running some internal calculation about risk and benefit that he recognized, because he ran the same calculation himself more often than he admitted. "I was looking for something," she said finally. "What kind of something?" Another long pause, then a truth, a specific truth about a specific lie. He nodded at this even though she couldn't see him. He understood that kind of errand. He'd run a few himself over the years, not officially sanctioned, not ordered, not compensated. The kind of mission that existed entirely because something had gone wrong and the official record said it hadn't, and you couldn't make peace with the gap between what you knew and what the record said. "Who shot you?" he asked. The copper eyes opened. She looked at him steadily. "Someone who did not want the truth found," she said. He sat with that for a while. The storm outside had dropped another register, from moan to something almost like breathing. He could hear the structural elements of the bivouac flexing gently as the pressure differential normalized. "Are they going to come back and check?" he asked. "They believe I am dead." "Are there others looking for you?" "Your own people." She hesitated. The hesitation was interesting. It was a different kind than before. This one had grief in it, he thought, or something grief adjacent, some Veth equivalent that sat in the same emotional neighborhood. "There were," she said. "There may not be any more." He understood what that meant. He'd known soldiers who'd gone out on patrols that stopped reporting. He knew the feeling of returning to a camp that no longer existed, not destroyed, just quietly emptied, the way things empty when people in authority have decided a situation is over. "Okay," he said. She looked at him. "Okay," he said again. "Tell me what you know and I'll tell you what I know, and maybe we can figure out together why someone wants both of us dead." The amber eyes were very still. "You are not both of us," she said. "You are the enemy." "I'm the enemy who pulled you out of the snow," he said. "That makes me a specific kind of enemy, the kind you should probably talk to." Another long silence. Then very slowly she turned her gaze to the ceiling of the bivouac, the low, pale fabric membrane above them, translucent enough to show the shifting shadow shapes of ice crystals in the wind, like watching slow weather from inside a lantern. "His name," she said, and the translator lagged, working, "is something you would say as Vareth. Was my counterpart. Our word for it means something between a partner and a responsibility, someone whose survival is also yours." "What happened to him?" "He found what we were looking for," she said. "And then he was found." It came out in pieces after that, the way testimony always did, not chronological, not clean, assembled from fragments and emotion and the spaces where she couldn't find words. He was patient. Patience was one of the few things he'd learned in the years since he'd been old enough to be sent to places that required patience, and he'd gotten good at the kind of listening that didn't push, didn't lead, just held itself open like a bowl. Vareth had been an analyst, not military, something more like a civil investigator, a position his translator kept wanting to render as keeper of accurate accounts. He had been looking into the disappearance of a transport vessel, a mid-range cargo carrier that had gone silent 18 months ago in this sector. Official records said it had suffered a cascade failure. The crew had been listed as lost. There had been a period of mourning and a period of investigation and then a finding. Accident, no fault, no further action required. Vareth had believed this was wrong. He had not believed it loudly or officially. He had believed it in the way careful people believed things when they had evidence that pointed elsewhere. Quietly, methodically, keeping the evidence in places it wouldn't easily be found, following threads that looked like coincidence until they stopped looking like coincidence. The transport had been carrying something, not on the manifest. The thing on the manifest was machinery parts, repair components, the kind of routine cargo that moved through sectors like water through channels, unremarkable and unremarked upon. The thing not on the manifest was a set of data cores, documentation, evidence, a record compiled by a Veth officer named Wren who had, months before the transport's disappearance, discovered what she believed was a pattern of deliberate sabotage in the Coalition's own communication infrastructure. Someone had been feeding information, not to humans, not to any enemy the Veth Coalition officially acknowledged, to a third party that had no name in any document Wren had been able to find, that left evidence of itself only in the shape of its absence, in the places where data should have existed and didn't, in the gaps that were too consistent and too precise to be accidents. She had compiled everything she knew. She had trusted it to Vareth, and Vareth had trusted it to a transport, and the transport had disappeared, and now Vareth was gone too, and Wren had come out to this nameless frozen ridgeline because the transport's last known trajectory had placed it somewhere near these coordinates, and she had believed, hoped, that the data cores were still here, somewhere, intact and waiting. Someone had been watching her believe this. The pendant, Kale said. Her hand moved to her throat, reflexive. That's why they shot you, he said. Not because you found anything, because you were still looking, because you were still the person who knew what to look for. A long silence. You are not entirely stupid, she said, and the translator delivered this without commentary, though he suspected it had been intended as something more nuanced. I've been told, he said. He turned his headlamp off entirely, leaving only the faint ambient glow that leaked through the bivouac membrane. In the near dark she was a shape made of breathing and the faint metallic sheen of the pendant. He could see it better now, the two curled lines, the symbol that might be her name. He thought about all the things that had been given names and then lost, and about the particular human stubbornness that kept people looking for them long after looking stopped making sense. The transport's crash site, he said. If it came down near these coordinates, it came down on the eastern slope. There's a secondary shelf about 4 kilometers from here that would have been the natural deceleration point. You know this terrain. I've been out here for 5 days. I've been over most of it. Another silence. Different quality this time. He was starting to be able to read them, or to read the spaces between her words the way you learn to read a voice you'd heard enough times. The black box, she said. You were also looking for something. A recorder from a downed scout craft, 3 weeks old. He paused. It had been reported as a navigation malfunction, automatic systems failure. He didn't say the next part. He didn't have to. She had enough context to complete the sentence herself, and she did it in the quality of her silence. You also do not believe the official story, she said. I believe what I can verify. And what have you verified? He thought about the recorder, about the data streams he'd partially accessed before the storm hit and forced him to shelter, about the navigation logs that didn't match the reported course, and the communication timestamps that had been scrubbed from the official record, but not from the raw telemetry. because whoever had done the scrubbing had known how the official record worked, and not how the raw telemetry was structured. Amateur work, the kind of erasure that assumed the right questions, would never be asked by someone who understood both systems. Enough, he said. The storm had gone almost quiet. Outside the bivouac, the ice waste lay in deep cold and deep silence, and somewhere out there, under 4 kilometers of frozen dark, there was a crashed transport and a set of data cores, and something that was either a conspiracy or a coincidence so large it had stopped being distinguishable from one. "Can you walk?" he asked. She considered this seriously, which he liked. She didn't say yes automatically the way pride prompted. She checked. "Not quickly," she said, "but yes." "Then we sleep for 4 hours," he said, "and then we go see what's on that slope." A pause, then, "Why?" He looked at the shape of her in the dark, the breathing outline of a person who had come out here alone to find a truth that someone powerful had tried to bury, and had nearly died for it, and was still asking why he would help. He thought about his sister, about the phone call 3 years ago and the official statement 3 weeks after that, and the careful, bloodless language that described an accident with no fault and no further action required. About the drawer in his bunk room at base, where he kept a photograph and a letter, and a small carved stone that she had sent him from a posting he'd never been able to find on any official map. He didn't say any of that. "Because the truth has weight," he said, using her translator's phrasing back at her, and she was quiet for a long time after that in a way that wasn't empty. They slept. He woke first, because he always woke first. 23 years of deployments and the habit was cellular by now. His body treated sleep as a resource allocation problem rather than a pleasure, spinning back up to consciousness at the first stir of change in ambient conditions. The storm had stopped entirely. The bivouac membrane showed clear pre-dawn sky, a deep matte black above, and a faint gradient of cold violet at the horizon that he associated with this planet's early mornings and nothing else. Ren woke 11 minutes later. He'd clocked it. She sat up slowly, tested the wound with careful fingers, made no sound. He handed her one of the 2 remaining field rations. She looked at it for a moment, the pressed block in its sealed wrapper, the logo of a human logistics company stamped in the corner, and then unwrapped it and ate half, and handed the other half back. "I do not know if this is compatible," she said. "I don't know either." "You ate it." "I have been hungry before." He understood this to mean something different than the words, that she had made peace with calculated risk, with taking what was available when alternatives were abstract. He put the half ration in his chest pocket and broke down the bivouac with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it in worse conditions than this, and they stepped out into the cold. The eastern slope was 4 kilometers, but it might as well have been 40. She was not slow exactly. She moved with careful deliberation, compensating for the wound with the whole-body adjustment of someone who understood their own mechanics. But the terrain was hostile, the ice crust unpredictable, and twice he caught her arm when the surface gave way beneath her and she started to pitch sideways. The second time she did not immediately pull away. She held the grip for 3 steps until she was steady and then released it without comment. He didn't comment either. Commentary would have made it something it didn't need to be. He thought, walking, about the shape of what she'd told him, about a third party with no name. About deliberate sabotage in communication infrastructure, not destruction, not jamming, but careful shaped interference, the kind that didn't announce itself. If you wanted to start a war between 2 civilizations, Cale thought, you didn't need weapons in the early stages. You needed bad information traveling reliably. You needed both sides to see each other through a lens that made violence look like the rational response. You needed messages that said one thing while meaning another, or messages that never arrived at all, or messages that arrived distorted in precisely the right ways. He'd been in 7 different combat deployments over the course of this war. In 3 of them afterward, he'd encountered intelligence analyses suggesting that the inciting incident had been different than reported. In two of those, the analysis had been classified, and he'd only seen it by accident. In one, the analyst who had written it had been reassigned to a posting where they could no longer publish findings. The drawer in his bunk room, the photograph, the letter, the small carved stone. His sister had been an intelligence analyst. He had not told command why he was actually out here. He had given them the orders that made sense, the scout ship recorder, the telemetry verification, and those orders were real, and those tasks were real, and he intended to complete them. But the coordinates he'd been given by his own channels, separate from command, the coordinates that matched Ren's coordinates within 800 meters, had come from the same analyst network that had employed his sister, and the same careful hands that had been quietly building the same case for 18 months. He had not known before today that the Veth side of the investigation had a face. He had not known before today that it had been someone like her. The shelf was there. He'd mapped it from a ridge 2 days ago, a natural promontory of compacted ice and stone that jutted from the slope at a shallow angle, a shelf wide enough to have caught something falling at velocity. He'd noted it as a potential shelter site. He looked at it differently now. The transport was under 4 meters of fresh snowfall and a secondary sheet of ice that had formed over the top in the days since the storm began. It was not immediately visible. He found it the same way he'd found her, by catching an edge with his boot, by the wrongness of the give beneath the surface crust, by the sense that what was underneath was not what it was supposed to be. They dug with their hands, which was slow and cold and unglamorous, and he took the heavier work because her wound made the lateral movement difficult, and she directed him with sharp precision to the areas most likely to yield the access panels. She knew the ship's layout, he realized. She'd seen one before. She'd maybe been on one, at some point, in whatever life had existed before the war made their two species permanently unfamiliar to each other. The hatch was intact. He got it open with a combination of his field tool and a Veth instrument she produced from inside her jacket, a short-handled thing with a rotating tip that adjusted as it worked, like a living creature. He didn't ask about it. They worked in parallel in silence, the way two people work when they've dispensed with the formality of introduction and are operating on the basic grammar of task. Inside, cold and dark, and the smell of burned circuitry and something organic, old and cold enough that it registered as absence rather than presence. The crew had been here. They were not now. He chose not to investigate that too carefully. The transport's interior was not large, mid-range cargo class, built for function rather than comfort. Every surface either a storage panel or a navigation surface or a support column. The lights were dead. He cracked 2 emergency chemical glow sticks from his kit and handed her one, and they moved through the ship in twin pale green pools of light. The cargo hold was at the rear of the vessel, accessible through a pressure door that had sealed on impact and required his field pry to open. The smell was worse here, not dangerous, not biological, just the specific flatness of air that had been sealed in a metal compartment for a long time at below freezing temperatures, like opening a drawer that had been shut for years, like opening a room you'd been afraid to open. The data cores were in the cargo hold, crated in standard shipping containers that had been padded with additional shock-absorbent material. Someone had been careful about this, had considered the possibility of impact. The crates were cracked but intact, the internal pressure seals still showing green on their indicators. 3 of them, marked with a Veth shipping code that meant standard machine components, and underneath it, in a handwriting that was not printed and not standardized, a single symbol. Her name symbol. Her hand went to the pendant without thinking. She held both things, the crate marking and the pendant, for a long moment, not moving. He watched the glow stick light catch her face and render it in chemical green, the copper eyes very bright in it, the expression on her face something that had no name in any language he knew. He knew, Cale said. He always knew, she said. Her voice, rendered through the translator, was very level. The leveling of it cost her something. He could see that in the set of her shoulders. He gave her the moment. He occupied himself with his own search, working toward the ship's flight recorder with methodical efficiency, located it in the same compartment where his intelligence had said it would be, removed it cleanly. He verified its integrity with his field scanner. It was intact, undamaged, full. He thought about what was on it. He thought about the communication timestamps, about the navigation logs, about the gap between the official record and the raw telemetry, and about how, if you put that gap alongside what was in these 3 crates, alongside what his sister had been building toward in the months before she disappeared, you had something that was no longer a theory. You had the shape of a deliberate act. You had someone choosing to start a war, and then choosing to make sure the war continued, and choosing with great care that the people most likely to notice were the first people removed from the conversation. "We need to get this out," he said. "You mean we need to not be killed before we get this out," she said. "Also that." She was already assessing the crates, hands moving over the surfaces, checking weight and dimensions against some internal calculation. She looked up and met his eyes, copper against the dark, precise and strange, and still somehow completely readable. "You are the enemy," she said again, but the words had changed their weight. They were not a statement of fact anymore. They were something closer to a habit she was examining, held up to the light to see what it was really made of. "I am," he said. "But I'm the enemy whose sister was Myra Vashon Cross, 3rd Intelligence Wing, posted to Sector 7, listed as lost in a navigation accident 16 months ago. And I don't believe that's what happened to her." The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. It was the silence of a fact arriving that changed the shape of everything around it. "Vashon Cross," she said slowly. The translator worked on it. There was a name in Vareth's files, a human analyst. Her data was in 3 of the cross-references he had. "Myra," he said. "She was," Wren stopped, started again. "She was not alone in this. She was corresponding with Vareth for 7 months, through channels that looked like automated maintenance protocols. They had never met. They had never," she stopped again, and this time it was not a lack of words but a weight that the words couldn't hold. He stood in the cold dark of the crashed transport, holding a black box recorder that contained the proof that someone had wanted his sister dead. And he thought about 2 people on opposite sides of a war that might not be a war, building the same case from different directions, corresponding through maintenance protocols, and never meeting. And about a pendant shaped like a name, about the kind of person who would put your name into metal and give it to you to keep while you did the dangerous work. "Was Vareth," he started. "He was everything," she said simply. He didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say, and she didn't need anything useful. She needed a minute, and he gave her the minute. And when she turned back to the crates, she was composed again in the specific way that grief composes itself when there is still work to do. They loaded what they could carry. 3 crates was too many. 1 crate was too much. He took the densest of the 3, the one whose internal scanner readings suggested the highest data density, and she took the smallest, and he rigged a drag harness from his bivouac material for the 3rd, and they started back out across the ice. 4 kilometers, in full cold, with a woman with a particle weapon burned through her ribs and a man who hadn't slept properly in 5 days. He thought about his squad back at base camp, who were supposed to wonder where he was. He thought about Command's timeline and the patrol sweep, and all the clean, sensible reasons this should already have been over. He thought about the fact that the data in this crate, if what Wren had described was accurate, would rewrite the origin story of a war that had been burning for 4 years and killing people at scale, and that both sides had been, in their own ways, assuming was real. He thought about what it meant to be the enemy of someone who was trying to tell you the same truth. They stopped twice. Once when she needed to redistribute the weight of the crate and the wound protested the redistribution, and once when the ice shelf gave under his foot without warning and he went down to one knee and had to dig his elbow into the surface to keep from taking the crate with him. She steadied him from the other side with both hands, weight braced, and it worked, and they stood there for a moment in the middle of the ice waste, each holding part of the other's balance, and neither of them said anything about it. He stumbled on a rise near the 3rd kilometer. She caught his arm, the same smooth grip, the same steadiness, and this time she held it longer. He found his footing. She released. They walked. The cold was a particular kind of cold, not aggressive, not the storm cold that had scoured the first 4 days. This was the settled cold, the deep winter cold that wasn't angry anymore because it had already won everything worth winning and could afford to be still. The sky was the flat gray-white of early morning here, and the ice reflected it back up, and they walked through a landscape that was all the same color from horizon to horizon, with nothing to tell up from down, except gravity and the ache in the legs. "What do we do when we get back?" she said at the 2-kilometer mark. "I have secure channels," he said. "People who are expecting what's on this recorder. People who have been building toward the same place from different directions. They'll know what to do with it." "On your side." "On my side." She walked for a while. "In my side." "Vareth built something for 18 months, he said. He documented it. He trusted it to a transport. Someone wanted it lost. It's still here. That means there are people on your side who have been waiting for it too." She was quiet again. He let it be quiet. "There is a communication node," she said eventually, "in the secondary relay station." She gave coordinates that he recognized, that Vareth and I established before. "It is still active. If I reach it, I can send what we have to 6 people on my side who have been waiting 17 months for this to surface." "You're 4 kilometers from the relay station right now," he said. "And 4 kilometers from a Veth Coalition patrol route." "I'm aware. They will not know that you are." "I know." A pause. "You will still be the enemy," she said. "Officially, afterward, whatever this does, it will not happen quickly enough that—" "I know," he said again. "That's not the point." The eastern horizon had started to lighten. Not the pre-dawn violet anymore, but the actual beginning of day, the pale wash that preceded direct light, when everything was visible in outline but nothing yet had color. She was visible beside him in outline, the line of her shoulder, the shape of the pendant at her throat, the careful walk of someone carrying more weight than was comfortable and bearing it without performing the bearing. He thought about his sister, who had never performed anything either, who had called him once during the 7th month of the war and said she thought there might be something wrong with how the whole thing had started, who had not been able to tell him more on an unsecured line, who had been posted to Sector 7 2 weeks later and gone silent a week after that. He had filed 3 requests for information. All had been processed and returned with standard form responses. He had waited for someone official to notice what he'd noticed. Then he had waited for someone unofficial to notice. Then he had stopped waiting and started looking. This was the something he had found. They reached the relay station at the same time that the light reached full intensity, sudden, flat, brilliant, the planet's own particular talent for revelation. The station was small, built into an ice shelf, automated, Veth construction. He had passed it twice in 5 days without approaching it. She worked the terminal with one hand and her shoulder braced against the housing, the wound limiting her range of motion to something that required specific adaptation. He held the crate steady so she could access the port, said nothing, watched the ice around them for any shadow that didn't belong. The upload took 11 minutes. He watched her face while it worked, the copper eyes tracking the progress indicator. The hand still at the pendant, not clutching now, just resting there, like a habit that had become structural. Like touching it was the same as touching something else, something that wasn't available anymore. He thought about what it meant to send something important off into channels and not know when it would surface, or what it would change, or whether the people waiting for it were still waiting. He thought about the particular faith of that, the faith of people who had been building toward a truth for so long that the building itself had become the relationship. "Done," she said. He handed her the second crate's access port, and she connected it without being asked and started the second upload and then looked up at him. "Your people," she said. "How do you send to them?" He pulled out the recorder, powered up his field transmitter, the one on encrypted burst protocol, the one that sent compressed data across a tight beam to a set of coordinates that would relay it to 6 people in a network he'd been part of since before he'd understood what the network was for. "Same way," he said, "through maintenance channels." She looked at him steadily. "Your sister helped build this." "Yes." She would have known Vareth was on the same path. She would have. Another silence. "Then, she would have liked knowing you were here." He didn't answer. The transmitter was working. The data was moving. Somewhere out there, in relay stations and secondary nodes and communication networks that looked like machine protocols, something that had been buried for 17 months was coming back up. He watched the transmit indicator and thought about Myra, about the specific quality of her stubbornness, not aggressive, not loud, but total. The stubbornness of someone who had decided that the truth had weight and would not put it down. She had not put it down. It had just taken this long to find the right hands. "They're coming," Wren said. He looked up. To the south, moving along the patrol route at standard sweep pace, 3 figures in Veth field gear, too far to have seen the station yet, probably 4 minutes. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Run," he said. That is an interesting instruction coming from someone who cannot outrun a Veth patrol in this terrain. "I wasn't talking to you." She didn't move. "If they see me," he said carefully, "they'll detain me. They'll take what I'm carrying. It goes into a Veth official process, and we both know what happens to things that go into official processes." "Yes," she said, "they disappear." "But if they see you," he said, "what happens?" A pause. "If I am alive and found by coalition forces, I have certain rights of access, formal rights, including the right to present evidence directly to a coalition council rather than through standard channels." "That's what I thought." She was looking at him, the copper eyes very still. "Go," he said. "Take the 3rd crate, present it formally. Do it right, do it the way that creates a record that can't be buried. And you." He checked his transmitter. The burst was complete. The data was out. What was in his hands now was just hardware, just metal and circuits. The story was already in the air, already moving. "I still have a scout ship recorder to return to command," he said. "And command's going to have some questions to answer when they read what's on it." She was still not moving. "Wren," he said, the name he'd given her in his head, not her real name, the sound that shifted pitch twice. "They're going to come looking for whoever shot you. And when they don't find a body, they're going to look harder. You need to be in a formal process before that happens. You need to be in a room with rights and witnesses and a record. And you need to be in your own formal process," she said, "with your own rights and your own witnesses. That's the plan." She looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. He thought about 2 people who had never met, building the same case from opposite sides, and about the specific courage of that. The courage of not knowing whether anyone was building from the other direction, and building anyway. The courage of Vareth, who had put her name in metal and hidden evidence in a crate, and sent it into the dark on the chance that someone was looking. The courage of his sister, who had written to a stranger through maintenance channels on the chance that the stranger was real. The courage it took to not put something down even when putting it down, was the easy and reasonable and survivable choice. "The truth has weight," she said. "Yes," he said. She picked up the third crate. She turned toward the southern ridge, then stopped and looked back. "Your sister," she said. "She sent Vareth a message 7 months before she was posted to Sector 7. He showed me once. It was," she paused, searching. "He said it was the first time he had believed the project would outlive either of them, that someone on the other side was thinking the same thoughts." He couldn't speak for a moment. "What did it say?" Ren looked at him steadily. She said, "I don't know who you are. I don't know if you're real or if this is a trap. But I know what I've found, and I know what it means, and I know I can't put it down. So here it is. Do what you can with it." The light was full now, brilliant and flat and merciless and honest. The patrol was 3 minutes out. In his hand the recorder was solid and cold and real. He said, "She always did have good instincts." And then Ren was moving, the crate against her uninjured side, crossing the ice at a pace that was neither running nor walking but something between functional, deliberate, the particular movement of someone who has a destination and intends to reach it. He watched her for a moment, the violet figure against the white expanse, growing smaller and then smaller again, and then briefly very visible against the ridge before she dropped below it and was gone. He turned south to meet the patrol. He had thought about what he was going to say. He had in fact thought about it for 2 days in various forms, knowing something like this moment was coming. He was going to say, "I was conducting a mission authorized under Standing Order 772, recovery of intelligence assets." He was going to say, "I have in my possession a flight recorder from a downed scout ship whose navigation logs contradict the filed accident report." He was going to say, "I would like to formally request that this recorder be reviewed by an independent intelligence board rather than the originating command." He was going to say it clearly and calmly, and he was going to put it on record, and there were going to be 6 people in a network who had just received the supporting data, and it was going to be difficult for anyone to bury again. And if they tried? He thought about his sister, who had looked at a thing that seemed impossible to move and had pushed on it anyway. He thought about Ren, crossing the ice with a crate full of evidence, and a pendant shaped like a name and a wound in her ribs that had not slowed her below the pace the task required. He thought about 2 people who had never met, corresponding through maintenance protocols, building the same argument from opposite ends, and about the particular human thing and the particular Veth thing, and maybe the particular living thing of not putting down the truth even when it would be easier, of picking it up again each morning, of carrying it into places where carrying it could get you killed, because putting it down would be its own kind of death, slower and quieter, but just as final. The patrol had seen him. He stood up straight. He put the recorder in his left hand visible. He raised his right hand open, not a weapon in it, not a threat, just a hand open, the way people opened hands across every distance and every difference since before there were words for what the gesture meant. The point soldier stopped, raised a hand in turn. They stood there in the brilliant cold light, 2 figures in the white expanse, on a planet that had no name yet on human charts and probably a name in Veth records that he would never be able to pronounce. And the word for what was happening had not been invented yet because the war had not made room for it. He started walking toward them. The recorder in his hand had the weight of 17 months of the dead and the living alike, of 2 people who had never met and the thing they had built together, of a sister who had looked at an impossible thing and pushed. The weight of a truth that had been buried in ice and frozen dark on a nameless slope, waiting for someone stubborn enough to come looking. He walked. Above him in the flat winter sky, the planet's first real sun was climbing, not the gray pre-dawn light but actual sun, orange and precise, burning the ice to a field of scattered sparks. He had always preferred the moment when the light arrived. Not because it made things better, because it made things visible. And visibility, he had learned from the best people he'd ever known, was where everything worth doing started. The point soldier's name, the designation that translated across the comm protocols, was Sergeant Yeva Ostrovedal, and she had been on patrol in this sector for 11 days, and she was not, she told him later, particularly surprised to find a human soldier standing in the open on a Veth patrol route holding a flight recorder. She was, she told him later, surprised that he was calm. He didn't know how to explain that calm to her in any way that would have made sense, so he didn't try. He handed over his identification. He stated his affiliation. He invoked the emergency information protocol that technically existed in the standing agreements between Human Command and Veth Coalition, and that technically required an intelligence review rather than a summary detention. He did this clearly and without theater, the way you did things when you needed them to be on record. She let him talk. She confirmed his ID. She looked at the flight recorder in his hand for a long moment, at the way he held it, out and visible, like someone holding out evidence rather than a weapon. "You came a long way for a recorder," she said. Her translator was better than his. The sentence came out in clean, unambiguous standard. "I came a long way for what's on it," he said. Another long look. "Then the woman, the Veth agent, was she with you?" He considered this carefully. He thought about the formal process, about the rights of access, about Wren crossing the ridge, already out of reach, already in the next phase of whatever this was going to become. "She was alive when I last saw her," he said. That was accurate, that was verifiable, that was all he needed to say. Ostrovedal looked at him for another moment. She was a soldier, which meant she understood the architecture of a careful answer, what it contained and what it excluded, and why the exclusions were as important as the content. She nodded once. "The review board meets in 48 hours, she said. "You will be transported and held in standard detention pending the review. You will have access to communication protocols under the emergency information provisions." She paused. "Your recorder will be logged as evidence and held in sealed custody. You will have the right to request an independent integrity verification before review." He felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight for a long time. "Thank you," he said, which was not a military formulation, which was just what it was. She looked at him, one more of those long, reading looks that he was becoming accustomed to, and then said something that her translator rendered as, "Someone waited a long time for what is on that recorder." He thought about Myra, about 17 months of maintenance protocols and careful evidence and names written in metal. "Yes," he said. "They did." The transport came 40 minutes later, a Veth Coalition mid-range shuttle that set down on the ice shelf with the particular precise gentleness of military craft flown by good pilots. He boarded it. He sat in the hold between two Veth soldiers who didn't speak to him, which was fine, and watched through the small viewport as the planet's surface receded, the white expanse, the gray ridgelines, the flat brilliant light that made everything visible. Somewhere down there, on a different heading toward a relay point and then a formal council, and then whatever came after that, was a woman with a wound in her ribs and a pendant shaped like her name, and 3 crates of evidence that had survived a crashed transport and a frozen wasteland, and someone trying very hard to make sure it was never found. He thought about what would happen when both sets of evidence hit the review processes at the same time, about what it would look like from the outside, from above, from the perspective of anyone trying to evaluate whether the war had started the way it had been reported to start, to have 2 soldiers from opposite sides arriving simultaneously at opposite ends of the same truth. He thought it would look like an argument that was very hard to dismiss. He thought about Myra, who had understood that a truth presented from one side could always be reframed as propaganda, but a truth that arrived from both sides at once became very difficult to reframe as anything other than what it was. She had always been smarter than him. He had tried to tell her that once before the war. She had told him he was wrong, but in a tone that said she was pleased he'd noticed. He looked out the viewport until the planet was a white disk in a dark field, and then a point, and then gone. He held the recorder in his hands, empty hands now, just the physical weight of a piece of hardware that had been packed and sealed, and was now in logged custody. And he held the empty feeling of it, the particular lightness of having set something down that you'd been carrying for a long time. Not over, not resolved, not simple, but in motion. The thing about the truth, he thought, and it was not a complicated thought, it was actually very simple, which was why it took 17 months and a frozen wasteland and an alien girl trying to die quietly in the snow to arrive at it. The thing about the truth was that it did not require you to carry it forever. It required you to carry it until someone else could carry it too. It required you to not put it down until you reached the right hands. Myra had carried it until Vareth could carry it. Vareth had carried it until the transport. The transport had carried it until the ice. The ice had held it until Ren. Ren had held it until him. And now it was in 6 hands on each side of a war, moving through channels that couldn't be easily closed, heading toward rooms where it would have to be answered. He leaned his head back against the shuttle's interior and closed his eyes. For the first time in 17 months, the sleep that came was clean.